October 25, 1944. Before dawn, off the coast of Samar in the central Philippines, the sea boiled with the fire of a clash that would defy every expectation of naval warfare. The tropical sky was heavy with storm clouds. Lightning flickered in the distance, but it was not thunder that shook the ocean. It was the thunder of guns. From the horizon emerged the dark silhouettes of Japanese battleships and cruisers, their decks bristling with 18-inch cannons, the largest ever to sail into battle. The Americans stationed there should have been swept aside like driftwood. Instead, the enemy encountered something impossible: tiny carriers, barely larger than merchant vessels, launching wave after wave of aircraft into the storm. Action Report Task Unit 77.4.3. Oct. 1944. The Japanese sailors peered through binoculars, their officers barking reports of flat tops where none should exist. The silhouettes on the horizon resembled no fleet carriers of the U.S. Navy. These ships were stubby, their flight decks short, their hulls narrow. Yet planes clawed into the sky from them, torpedo bombers and fighters charging into a battle they had no business winning. To the enemy it was a nightmare come to life. Escort carriers, made not in mighty naval shipyards, but in converted cargo slips in the heart of America's industrial belt, were about to change the rhythm of war. Japanese Naval Staff Report, 1945. To understand this moment, one must step back. In 1941, the U.S. Navy entered the war with only 7 fleet carriers. Their numbers were few, their flight decks precious. Japan, by contrast, began the Pacific War with 10 fleet carriers, honed to razor sharpness by years of aggressive training and doctrine. Each side knew carriers would decide the war. But the problem for the Americans was one of scale. How to patrol an ocean larger than the moon's surface with so few capital ships? How to escort convoys, guard invasion fleets, and maintain constant pressure, all at once? The answer, though derided by some admirals at first, came from the blueprint of a simple merchant hull. U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships Report, 1942. The idea was audacious. Take the hulls of slow mass-produced cargo ships, liberty ships, tankers, bulk freighters, and graft onto them a flat deck. No armored citadel, no massive catapults, just enough steel, wood, and flight equipment to launch and recover a handful of planes. These were not built to duel battleships or strike at enemy bases 1,000 miles away. They were built for endurance, for ubiquity, for being everywhere the fleet could not be. They would be the Jeep carriers, an unglamorous nickname that stuck. Much to the sailors' chagrin, Naval Aviation News, Aug. 1943. By 1943, the first of these escort carriers, known as CVEs, slid down the slips of Kaiser shipyards and the Sun shipbuilding yards in Pennsylvania. The Casablanca class alone saw 50 ships produced in barely 2 years, an industrial feat impossible for Japan to match. Their average displacement was 10,400 tons, compared to 27,000 for a fleet carrier. Their top speed, a mere 19 knots, far too slow to outrun enemy battleships. But they carried 28 aircraft, enough to provide an umbrella of fighters and bombers over a convoy or amphibious landing. Their very existence embodied America's industrial philosophy: quantity, ubiquity, and adaptability over singular perfection. U.S. Maritime Commission Report, 1944. To the German U-boat commanders prowling the Atlantic, these ships soon became a curse. Convoys that once sailed with merchantmen vulnerable now bristled with air cover hundreds of miles from land. The CVE's Wildcats and Avengers hunted submarines relentlessly, sinking over 50 U-boats in the Atlantic alone. But it was in the Pacific, against the Japanese fleet, where these cheap flat tops would etch their legend. U.S. Strategic Anti-Submarine Report, 1945. By late 1944, the Pacific War reached its climax. The U.S. invasion of the Philippines was underway, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific. To protect the landing forces at Leyte Gulf, Admiral Thomas Sprague's escort carriers were stationed in 3 task units, nicknamed Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. They were supposed to cover landing beaches from the air, not fight battleships. Their decks launched close air support missions, not carrier strikes. Their escorts consisted of destroyers and destroyer escorts, tin cans against giants. The doctrine was clear. Fleet carriers fought fleets. Escort carriers supported invasions. But on October 25th, That doctrine would shatter. U.S. 7th Fleet War Diary, Arc 1944. At dawn, the Japanese center force, commanded by Admiral Kurita, surged through San Bernardino Strait. Its strength was terrifying. 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Against this armada, the sailors of Taffy 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The odds were mathematically absurd. Yet the impossible unfolded. As Kurita's lookouts raised alarms about American carriers, confusion reigned. Japanese officers assumed they faced fleet carriers. No one could fathom that such tiny, fragile ships could stand against the pride of the Imperial Navy. Japanese Action Report 1944. The air crackled with chaos. Avengers, loaded with bombs for ground support, were hastily armed with torpedoes mid-morning. Wildcats attacked in desperate strafing runs, diving on cruisers bristling with anti-aircraft fire. On the sea, destroyers like USS Johnston and USS Hole charged headlong into the battleships, laying smoke, firing torpedoes at suicidal ranges. All the while, the escort carriers turned desperately, zigzagging at 17 knots, their flight decks shuddering under constant launches and recoveries. Pilots ran out of ammunition and dropped practice bombs, even firing pistols at enemy decks. It was a scene of sheer improvisation and grit, born of desperation and disbelief. After Action Report USS Johnston, Oct. 1944. The Japanese sailors could scarcely believe it. Officers aboard Yamato reported frantic incoming aircraft waves, as though from multiple carriers. Bundesarchiv, Captured Report 1945. They could not comprehend that these were glorified cargo ships. To them, the illusion was that the Americans had reinforced Leyte with far more carriers than intelligence predicted. Confusion bred hesitation. Hesitation bred retreat. But the truth was harsher. These escort carriers were outmatched. Their decks burned, their crews bled. Gambia Bay, a Casablanca-class CVE, was pummeled into a sinking wreck by cruiser shells. Yet in their sacrifice, they created the illusion of strength. Their planes, their escorts, and their very existence sowed enough doubt to make Admiral Kurita turn away. The Japanese center force, poised to annihilate the invasion fleet, withdrew. A handful of converted cargo ships had turned the tide. U.S. Naval War College analysis, 46. That morning ended not in annihilation, but survival. A survival that shocked the enemy and stunned the Americans themselves. The escort carriers had not been built to fight battleships, but in the cauldron of Samar they had done so. How? What hidden advantage allowed converted cargo ships to stand against the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy? The answer lies not only in steel and aircraft, but in the minds of engineers, the sweat of welders, and the imagination of strategists who saw possibility where others saw weakness. And in Section 2, the secret of their true power will be revealed. November 12, 1941. Inside the cavernous workshops of the Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, welders' torches lit the darkness with sparks as bright as lightning. The air reeked of molten steel, sweat, and cigarette smoke. Here, engineers and factory hands were not merely building ships, they were redefining what a warship could be. Where once months and years were required to construct a carrier, these men and women, many of them untrained before the war, learned to deliver a ship in weeks. Their raw material was not the sleek lines of a battle fleet hull, but the blunt skeleton of a cargo ship. Into this form they poured ingenuity. By the end, the United States Navy would have a fleet of escort carriers, cargo ships reborn as war machines, constructed faster than any empire had imagined possible. U.S. Maritime Commission Industrial Report, 1943. The secret advantage lay in the philosophy of production. Fleet carriers like the Essex class required skilled shipyards, complex catapults, armored decks, and years of labor. Escort carriers, by contrast, were modular. The Casablanca class, the most numerous, used mass production techniques. Prefabricated sections were welded together in assembly line style. In Portland, Philadelphia, Tacoma, and beyond, shipyards hammered out one CVE after another with astonishing speed. Some were launched just 90 days after their keels were laid. This was not elegance. This was industrial brute force, a storm of steel overwhelming the limitations of time. U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships Report, 1944. Yet speed alone was not enough. The vessels had to function as carriers, launching aircraft into the teeth of the Pacific. Naval engineers designed the Casablanca class with a flight deck 477 feet long, shorter than half a football field compared to the fleet carriers. Elevators hoisted aircraft from tiny hangars below. Though only one plane could be raised at a time, arrestor cables caught landing fighters, but with none of the redundancy of larger decks. Each ship carried about 28 aircraft, mostly FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers. They could not hurl forth great waves of bombers, but they could sustain a steady drumbeat of patrols and strikes, the relentless hum of a swarm, rather than the roar of a single thunderclap. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. For defense, these ships bristled with 20mm Oerlikon cannons and later 40mm Bofors guns. They were still vulnerable, their hulls thin, their decks unarmored. But the point was not invincibility, it was expendability. Escort carriers could be risked, where fleet carriers could not. Their role was to escort convoys, provide anti-submarine patrols, and deliver close air support for amphibious landings. In truth, their strength was not in armor or firepower, but in presence. They filled the vast Pacific with American flight decks, multiplying the Navy's reach until Japanese commanders could no longer trust any horizon. Bureau of Ordnance Report, 1944. From the enemy's perspective, it was a nightmare. Japanese doctrine, forged in the interwar period, prized decisive battle. They envisioned carrier duels decided by concentration of force. What they encountered instead were swarms of small carriers appearing in unexpected places, 1,000 cuts rather than one hammer blow. One Japanese officer, interrogated after the war, admitted in frustration, "We never understood how so many carriers appeared from nowhere. We thought America must have twice the industry we estimated." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogations, 1946. The escort carrier's true moment of vindication came in the Pacific at Leyte Gulf, not in the initial Hook Battle of Samar, but days earlier during the Battle of Leyte itself. On October 20th, 1944, American troops began their landings on the beaches of Leyte. Offshore, 18 escort carriers of Task Group 77.4 and 77.5 launched aircraft in endless sorties to suppress Japanese airfields, strafe defenses and bomb artillery positions. Between dawn and dusk, CVEs flew hundreds of sorties, sustaining a constant curtain of air support that fleet carriers could not have maintained without exhausting their squadrons. It was the CVEs that made the beaches survivable. After Action Report, TG 77.4, Oct. 1944. On October 24th, the Japanese launched their largest air counterstrike. Waves of bombers roared toward the invasion fleet. Fleet carriers further east were too distant to respond. The escort carriers of Taffy 2 and Taffy 3 scrambled everything they had. Wildcats clawed at the sky in chaotic dogfights, while Avengers dropped depth charges and bombs on approaching aircraft when their guns ran dry. Some CVEs absorbed direct hits. USS Suwannee was struck by a kamikaze, gouging fire into her flight deck, yet she continued to recover aircraft within hours. It was a harbinger of the kamikaze terror soon to come, but also proof that even converted cargo hulls could endure. Repair and keep fighting. Damage report USS Suwannee, 1944. Technical limitations became tactical strengths. The slow speed of the CVEs forced them to remain with convoys and landing forces, ensuring that their aircraft were always directly overhead where they were needed most. Unlike fleet carriers, they did not vanish over the horizon. For the Marines on the beaches, this meant continuous cover. For Japanese pilots, it meant constant harassment with no respite. In every bay, every convoy, every landing, there seemed to be an American flight deck ready to strike. The illusion of omnipresence was born of simple math. Over 120 escort carriers built between 1941 and 1945. Japan could not comprehend such scale. War Production Board Report, 1945. Inside the Japanese fleet, disbelief turned to rage. Reports from cruisers at Samar spoke of enemy carriers numerous and evasive when in truth only 6 escort carriers stood before them. To the gunners aboard Yamato, the sight of aircraft swarming from multiple directions created the impression of a much larger fleet. Pilots recalled later how they deliberately staggered their attacks, so that as one wave peeled away, another appeared, giving the illusion of infinite reinforcements. It was theatre as much as war, but it bought time, and in naval warfare time was life. Pilot debrief USS Fanshawe Bay, Oct. 1944. Even more crucial was the adaptability of the CVE's crews. These were not the elite squadrons of fleet carriers, but reservists, hastily trained aviators, and sailors who had never expected to duel battleships. Yet in the crucible of Samar they became legends. Pilots rearmed with whatever weapons they could find, depth charges, smoke bombs, even machine gun strafing when ammunition ran dry. Engineers kept damaged flight decks patched together with spare steel, wooden planks and sheer ingenuity. Every hand aboard, from cook to mechanic, became part of a desperate ballet of survival. Crew log, USS White Plains, Oct. 1944. The engineers who designed the escort carriers never claimed they were perfect. H.C. Nelson of the Bureau of Ships once remarked, "They are not fast nor elegant, but they are ships we can afford to lose." That grim assessment carried its own irony. In practice, their very expendability meant they were risked more often, fought harder, and became more indispensable than many fleet carriers. It was the hidden advantage of perception. They appeared weak but multiplied in such numbers. They became a weapon of psychological dominance. Bureau of Ships memo. 1943. At Leyte Gulf, when Kurita finally withdrew, he left behind a trail of confusion. Japanese survivors later wrote that they had faced superior carrier forces. Japanese Naval Debrief, 1945. In reality, it had been escort carriers and tin cans, cargo ships and destroyer escorts, punching far above their weight. The hidden advantage was not that these ships were powerful. It was that they existed at all in such numbers, in such places, at such times. They were America's industrial magic trick, and Japan never solved it. As the smoke cleared, one truth became undeniable. The humble escort carrier, born from a cargo hull, had played a decisive role in one of the largest naval battles in history. Yet the deeper impact of these ships was not confined to one day at Samar or one landing at Leyte. Their legacy would ripple outward, reshaping strategy, morale, and the psychology of war itself. The world would soon discover that these jeep carriers had left scars not only on steel, but on the minds of friend and foe alike. And in Section 3, the true strategic and psychological legacy of the escort carrier will be revealed. The months after Leyte Gulf revealed just how deeply the escort carriers had reshaped the character of the Pacific War. For the Americans, their value extended far beyond the narrow frame of a single battle. These converted cargo ships became the very heartbeat of the advance across the Central and South Pacific. For the Japanese, their presence was a psychological torment, proof of an enemy whose industry seemed bottomless, whose ingenuity had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. The story of the escort carriers was no longer simply about ships, it was about endurance, morale, and the industrial imagination that gave flesh to strategy. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Every campaign after mid-1944 bore their stamp. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, escort carriers launched thousands of sorties in support of Marines clawing their way up volcanic slopes. The fleet carriers struck at distant airfields, but it was the CVEs that hovered constantly offshore, delivering bombs, rockets, and strafing fire within minutes of a request. Pilots recalled how they orbited so low and so frequently that Marines on the ground recognized the silhouettes of individual Wildcats and Avengers. Pilot debrief, USS Anzio, Feb. 1945. Their very slowness, once mocked, became a virtue. They were always close, always accessible. Their air groups tied directly to the desperate needs of men in foxholes. At Okinawa in April 1945, the escort carriers faced their severest test. There the storm of kamikaze attacks fell with unprecedented fury. Fleet carriers, with their speed and layered defenses, often dodged or absorbed the blows. But the CVEs, with thin skins and limited escorts, were struck again and again. USS Sangamon, USS Sewanee, USS Santee, all were hit multiple times, yet even aflame, their crews fought to land aircraft, patch decks, and resume sorties. A sailor aboard the Sangamon wrote in his diary, "We were on fire, the deck torn open, but planes kept circling above, waiting. We had no choice but to bring them down." Sangamon Decklog, April 1945. The escort carrier had become a symbol of stubborn resilience, a floating embodiment of American determination to press forward despite staggering loss. For the Japanese pilots diving from the sun, the CVEs carried a double weight. On one hand, they were vulnerable targets, ships that could be struck down more easily than the armored Essex-class giants. But on the other hand, they never seemed to disappear. Destroy one, and another appeared days later, fresh from the American assembly lines. One Japanese survivor interrogated after the war admitted, "It was like cutting grass. You strike them, they burn, but always more grow in their place." Interrogation of Japanese POW U.S. Navy, 1945. This sense of futility eroded morale as much as combat losses. Each CVE destroyed was not a decisive victory, but a reminder of America's inexhaustible well of ships and planes. Behind every carrier stood a story of industrial labor. Engineers, welders, draftsmen, and riveters in Pennsylvania, California, and Oregon transformed anonymous cargo hulls into weapons of war. Women worked assembly lines at Sun Shipbuilding, riveting flight decks under floodlights through the night. At Kaiser's yards, prefabricated hull sections rolled from factories like parts of automobiles. For many, the escort carriers were their contribution to the war, and their fingerprints lay in every weld and every plate of steel. The men who sailed them often wrote letters home, thanking factory workers for giving them a ship that, though fragile, could keep them alive. Letter from USS Casablanca crew to Kaiser shipyard workers, 1944. In combat zones, it was the ingenuity of repair crews that sustained them. CVEs lacked the vast workshops of fleet carriers, yet their sailors improvised constantly. Damaged arrestor cables were replaced with lengths of anchor chain. Bullet holes were patched with scrap plate, seams sealed with concrete or wood. Mechanics cannibalized parts from wrecked planes to keep Avengers flying. The ships were not merely war machines, they were canvases of improvisation, made whole again by the skill of ordinary sailors. Maintenance report. USS Kitkun Bay, 1945. Strategically, the escort carriers freed the fleet carriers to concentrate on decisive strikes. By taking on the grinding work of convoy escort and close support, CVEs allowed Essex-class flat-tops to range farther, striking at Formosa, the Ryukyus, and even the Japanese home islands. This division of labor multiplied American strength. It was as though the Navy had cloned itself, one arm punching deep, the other shielding the vulnerable lifelines behind it. Naval War College Analysis, 1946. The Japanese never found a counter. They could no longer threaten every convoy, every landing. The shadow of the escort carrier stretched across every corner of the Pacific. Psychologically, their impact was profound. For American troops, the sight of CVEs offshore was reassurance that they were not abandoned. At Leyte, Marines described how aircraft seemed to arrive within minutes of a radio call. At Okinawa, exhausted infantry watched planes sweep overhead day and night, symbols of relentless support. Morale soared not only because of what these ships did, but because of what they represented, the promise that no matter how far forward men fought, American industry would be there with them. U.S. Army Oral History, Okinawa Campaign, 1946. For the Japanese, the psychological toll was reversed. Post-war surveys revealed that many officers despaired at the sheer ubiquity of American carriers. "We never knew where they came from," one captain admitted. "They seemed to grow out of the sea itself." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Naval Interrogations, 1946. This sense of being outproduced, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed corroded the will to fight. Even the mighty Yamato, symbol of naval supremacy, found itself humiliated at Samar by what its crew believed were inferior carriers. Pride had been broken by cargo ships turned into weapons. The legacy of the escort carriers did not end with the Pacific War. Their influence carried forward into the Cold War and beyond. In Korea, similar ships provided close air support at Incheon. In Vietnam, helicopter assault ships borrowed their template, simple decks on cargo hulls, delivering constant aviation support. Even in the Gulf War, the logic of distributed, plentiful aviation assets echoed the lesson of the CVEs. Modern littoral combat ships and light carriers carry their DNA, the idea that ubiquity and presence can outweigh raw power. U.S. Naval Historical Review, 1989. Above all, the lesson was industrial and psychological. America had proven that it could transform ordinary cargo ships into extraordinary war machines, saturating oceans with presence. This was not merely about firepower. It was about conviction, about never leaving soldiers and sailors without air cover, about forcing the enemy into despair through the sheer rhythm of production. As one American admiral later reflected, the escort carrier was never meant to be heroic, yet it became the ship of heroes. Adam Sprague, Oral History, 1952. In the end, the German sailors in the Atlantic and the Japanese officers in the Pacific shared the same disbelief. They could not comprehend that the fragile silhouettes on the horizon were born from cargo slips. They expected strength to come from steel giants. Instead, it came from humble workhorses, multiplied by industry, elevated by courage, and so, from sparks in shipyards to smoke on distant horizons, the escort carriers carved their legend, not as mighty warships, but as the improbable miracle of ordinary steel turned into extraordinary salvation. As one pilot of Taffy 3 wrote, "Gazing back at the burning waters of Samar, we flew from cargo ships, and from them we broke the enemy's pride. In modern war, the lesson endures. Connection outweighs firepower, presence defeats perfection, and the humblest vessel can carry the weight of destiny."